We'll be reading John 2, 1 to 11, the wedding at Cana. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "I have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it had come from, though the stewards who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then serves the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him.
In reporting this first act of Jesus' ministry, this first miracle, this moment when Jesus reveals God's glory shining through him so soon in his ministry that even he thinks it might be premature, John already establishes a pattern that will repeat itself in his gospel. The pattern is this. There's a problem. The problem is brought to Jesus' attention. Jesus seems almost indifferent to the problem, but then, in the end, Jesus does something dramatic and wonderful, revealing God's glory that is in Jesus. Jesus, the human demonstration of how much goodness God wants to give us. A goodness that we are then invited to put our belief, our trust in. Did you see all that happening there? There's a problem. The wedding party's still raging, but the bride and groom have run out of wine, which in that time apparently would have brought profound shame on them and their families. The problem is brought to Jesus' attention. Mary says simply, "They have no wine." Jesus seems almost indifferent, like to the extent of actually sounding rude. "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." But then, in the end, Jesus does something dramatic and wonderful. Jesus has 6 stone jars filled with water, and then he turns that water into wine. Not just that, but he turns that water into wine that's so good that the chief steward, oblivious to where this wine came from, declares to the bridegroom, "Everyone serves the good wine first and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk, but you kept the best for last." And then the story closes with John reminding us this was the first of Jesus' signs which revealed his glory, and the disciples believed. For now, as we read John and we're barely 2 chapters in, this pattern is new, but it's going to keep happening. 2 chapters later, while Jesus is returning to Cana, where that wedding was, by the way, a royal official with a dying son runs to Jesus, begging Jesus to come and heal his boy. But instead of saying yes and just going, Jesus seems indifferent, saying cryptically, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you'll not believe." So the man begs him again to come. And finally, Jesus says, "Go, your son will live." And lo and behold, wonder of wonders, the man goes home and his son has recovered. This, John reports, was Jesus' second sign, which we can now see follows the pattern of what John told us was the first sign, the sign that revealed God's glory, the sign that revealed that Jesus is the living, breathing example of how much goodness God wants to give us. And so this father and his entire household join the disciples now in believing in this glory, in trusting that Jesus has, in fact, revealed how much goodness God wants to give them. And then Jesus does it all over again. In John 11, there's another problem. Now Jesus' friend, Lazarus, is dying. So his sisters, Mary and Martha, send a message to Jesus telling him what's going on. But Jesus sends back a message that basically says, he won't die. Rather, God's glory and my role in showing you that glory will be revealed through this. And then, shockingly, Jesus just kicks back where he is for a while. And as a result, by the time he gets to Lazarus' house, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. But, wonder of wonders, Jesus invites Lazarus out of the grave, and Lazarus is alive again. All right after Jesus asks Martha, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" See the pattern? There's a problem. Jesus is informed of the problem. Jesus seems almost indifferent to the problem, sometimes almost cruelly indifferent to the problem. And then, in the end, after it seems Jesus has let everything fall apart, Jesus does something wonderful that solves the problem. In God's glory, what God wants us to see about God's self is revealed through Jesus. It is revealed that God wants to offer us a lot of goodness. If this is all sounding vaguely familiar, if this all sounds like something even bigger that you've once heard about, well, that's probably because these examples, big and miraculous and wonderful as they are actually only tiny little versions of the even greater truth that each gospel, John included, want to show were revealed with Jesus's entire life. And it all happens in that hour that Jesus, the wedding, tells Mary is coming later, at that hour when his glory would really, really, really be revealed. And the lead up to that hour and the familiar pattern that precedes it begins right after that Lazarus story. Because right after the Lazarus story, John introduces us to another problem. Some religious leaders want to kill Jesus because with all these people seeing God's glory, with all these people seeing through Jesus that God wants much better for them than what they're getting, the Romans are going to be threatened. And the Romans are going to try to destroy their religion and them as a people. But to put it simply, problem leaders want to kill Jesus. And then, as happens in this pattern, we find out that Jesus is aware of the problem. Jesus knows that people wanting to kill him are waiting for him in Jerusalem. And so then Jesus, with all these people counting on him to usher in this new future he has promised them, Jesus seems indifferent. He walks right into Jerusalem, into the lion's den, so to speak. He allows himself to be arrested. He doesn't even really fight the charges, and he's executed like a common criminal. And as a result, you would have to forgive everyone involved for concluding that their hopes for Jesus to help them, their confidence that Jesus had shown them God's glory, God's intention for incredible goodness to them, are shot, dead, like Jesus, who didn't even seem to care enough to fight. But then, when all seems to have been long lost, when the ending already seems written in stone, like written in a gravestone, well, you know the rest. Jesus is resurrected. Jesus comes back from the dead. The most wonderful, incredible thing imaginable happens, and there at the very end, after what was already supposed to be the end, God's glory is shown. God's glory is shown through Jesus to once again be how much goodness God wants to give us. In the Gospel of John, this pattern has been building up to this ultimate revelation the whole time, and it all goes back to that little wedding in Cana. That wedding in Cana, what we might call the first sip of a wonderful wine in John's gospel that will later be delivered by the caseload on Easter. Water into wine after all the wedding's been drunk dry and Jesus has seemed to think it's not his problem. A boy brought back from the brink of death when Jesus at first seems disinterested in even going to see him. Lazarus brought out of the grave after Jesus at first seems to be dilly-dallying for days. The resurrection itself. I could remind you of all the different parts of that pattern again, or I could just say this, which you might find easier to remember. What we already see in this little wedding story is this, that when it comes to problems, when it comes to hardship that we have begun to conclude that Jesus might not care about, when our prayers seem to have fallen on deaf ears, Jesus saves the best for last. In each of these instances, Jesus not only saves the best for last, Jesus saves the best for after we would have begun to conclude, often kind of understandably, I would add, that Jesus must not care after all. Have you experienced that in your life before? Has some problem seemed to have left you, your family, or your community feeling fully deflated? So much so that you question whether Jesus even cares one tiny speckle, only for something glorious to unexpectedly spring up in, maybe even through the aftermath. Perhaps you've experienced it with aging. Maybe you've moved from one stage of life to the next, perhaps, say, moving from the house you've had for decades into something smaller and easier to manage. And perhaps as you've watched so many of your memories sold at a yard sale or dropped off at St. Vinny's, you've begun to wonder, does Jesus even care how hard it is to get older in this world? And maybe even as you've tried to settle into your new place, it's all seemed too foreign and you miss what you had. And even though you've been praying, asking Jesus to help you with it all, and your prayer just doesn't seem to be getting answered, you wonder, does Jesus even care? But then one day, you're sitting around your new table and you look around the table to see it filled with friends, to see it filled with new friends you've met because of your move, and old friends that you now seem to be spending more time with than you used to. And it's all so wonderful. And maybe you realize, did Jesus, maybe in the end, did Jesus save the best for me for last? Or maybe if you're a parent, you've experienced it with parenting, struggling with a tendency in your child's behavior, maybe even some destructive behavior, and you remind them and you remind them and you try all the strategies they say to try and you pray for your child, and all along nothing seems to change, and you begin to wonder, does Jesus even care? And then one day, perhaps even 1, 2, 3, or 12 years later, you watch your child playing with another child. They don't know you're watching, but you're watching. And the other child starts doing the thing that you thought you could never get your child to stop doing. And you watch as your child calmly puts a hand on that other child's shoulder. And kid you not, your child gently, casually, lovingly, with the maturity they've been developing all along, but that you couldn't see as you couldn't see as the forest because you were lost in all the parenting trees, your child comfortingly speaks to their friend exactly those words you spoke to them again and again and again. Those words that you thought were going in one ear and out the other, but which now are being spoken like they've become as natural to them as breathing. You might ask yourself in that moment, did Jesus maybe in the end, did Jesus maybe save the best until now? Or maybe you've just moved from one school to another, or are about to graduate from high school or college, and you look down the road and you see how hard it will be, or it is so hard right now, and you wonder if your best years are already behind you because this new stage of life is already so hard. Well, maybe now's the time for me to encourage you and say, turn to any of us here who have gone through any of those transitions. And I suspect that most of us will agree that those stages of early adulthood are hard, but also hang in there. Because maybe even just when you're ready to give up, Jesus just may have saved up the best to give you after that. I share this pattern with you because it's Jesus's resurrection truth in the stages of life we go through and in what is beyond this life. It's Jesus's resurrection truth that tells us that even if we breathe our last breath in pain, God, through the resurrection, wants to assure us that there's more beyond that breath, that God has saved the best for last, mysterious as that all is. But I also share this lesson today because I know that many of us might need to be reminded of it as we struggle with yet another spike in COVID. As we gather on a Sunday when we have once again had to cancel Sunday school and switch to online worship. After we really, truly thought that we were done with those kinds of restrictions. I mean, as a congregation, we thought we had made it through this pandemic, right? We thought we'd made it through safely and come out the other side even healthier as a church family than we were before it. And now, it feels like it's back. The refreshing drink of normalcy we just had feels like it's now being withheld from us. Amidst it all, we once again carry fears about sick kids, like that royal official did, and grief over the sting of death around us, like Mary and Martha did. The metaphorical wine bottles we uncorked to celebrate our return to in-person church and Sunday school, metaphorical bottles at church at least. I won't speak to how you celebrated our return to in-person church at home. They seem to have been drunk dry. And we ask, Jesus, do you even care anymore? And for a moment, perhaps for this moment, the answer could appear to some of us like it might even be no. But still, I'm here with the Gospel of John in hand. I'm here with all four Gospels' greatest truth about Jesus in hand to say, fear not and hang on. Because we are the followers of the one who may have seemed cold and distant to a father with a dying son, but then healed him without even having to see him. We are the followers of the one who may have seemed cold and distant to his own dying friend, but who then brought that friend back from the dead. And we are the followers of one who allowed himself to be crucified, only to then defeat death itself to show God's glory, to be the sign that God wants goodness for us. Goodness so wonderful that it passes even our own expectations. Let's be honest. I don't know why Jesus seems cold and distant sometimes in situations like these. Some probably might say that he intentionally lets the drama build so that he can reveal his glory even more dramatically. Maybe. But honestly, to me, that just makes Jesus, the one who came here to show us how close God wants to get to us, to seem even colder and more distant. So that answer doesn't really work for me. And I don't really have a complete answer. But what I do know is this, that these stories honestly reflect what we do so often go through. These stories reflect the truth that often, as I know some of us have now with the pandemic, we can get to a point that we think Jesus is indifferent. And these stories remind us that we're not alone in that. These stories remind us that it's even okay to name that. And then these stories remind us that as mysterious as that all is, that's not actually the case. We can trust in God's glory, which, as Jesus revealed to us, is that God wants goodness for us. And so often that goodness arrives as if the best has been saved for last, after more time than we would have liked, but then also as something sometimes more wonderful than we could have ever even imagined in the first place. So if you're struggling with the stage of life you're in, be it a later stage in life, the parenting stage of life, or the growing into full adulting stage of life, or if you're struggling with the question, why God? Why, after it seemed like you had answered our prayer and brought us back to church and in-person Sunday school, why, after you had seemed to answer our prayer so wonderfully, are we still back to struggling through this thing? Or if you're struggling with something else entirely, I invite you to hold whatever that is up to God right now instead. Whatever it is, I invite you to imagine it as an empty jug that was once full of your favorite drink, whatever you drink when you're celebrating, and now seems to be bone dry. And I invite you to hear this. John tells us that each of these stories was told so that we might recognize that God wants goodness for us and so that we might trust in that. In fact, with both the father of the sick boy and with Mary and Martha, before they see the miracle even happen, John tells us that they believed before they saw. After Jesus says to the father, "Go, your son will live," the man believed and started on his way. Before Jesus even asked Lazarus to come out of the grave, Martha says, "Yes, Lord, I believe." All too often, I think we've boiled statements like, "Yes, Lord, I believe," down to a kind of faith that's sort of superstitious, a faith that says, God will answer your prayer if you really, really, really believe it will happen, which tragically he also has also meant that we've unfortunately told people if God didn't answer your prayer, it must be because you didn't believe enough, which sure is a way to kick someone when they're down, isn't it? But another way to see it is like this, that through Jesus, God's glory is revealed to be that God wants goodness for us. And to believe is to trust that, to cling to that, to find hope in that, to hang on to that as our lifeline, even when we have nothing else that we think we can hold on to remember that we follow one who wants what is good for us. And that even when that good seems far away and out of reach and long lost, and even when we begin to question if Jesus cares, time and again, mysterious as it is, Jesus saves the best for last. We may not know how long we're going to have to wait. We may never be able to predict what that goodness will actually look like when it comes. But thanks to stories like today's, we can turn to one another and say this. Don't throw those empty wine jugs or jugs of whatever you most like to drink. Don't throw those away just yet. Or if you do, at least make sure you have some backup water pitchers hanging around, because we follow the one who saves the best for last.